The first time I saw him, I almost didn't. That is the thing about a man who has spent his entire life being the most visible person in any room. When he decides to become invisible, even partially, even imperfectly, he becomes genuinely difficult to locate. Not because he is disguised, not because he is hiding, but because your brain simply refuses to file the image correctly. It was a Tuesday morning in February, the kind of February morning that London specializes in grey in a way that feels personal, damp in a way that soaks through optimism before it reaches your coat. I was at Waterloo Station, running 12 minutes late for a press briefing I had already half decided wasn't worth attending, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had gone cold somewhere between the ticket barriers and platform 9. And there he was, Prince William, first in line to the British throne, President of the Earthshot Prize, Colonel of the Irish Guards, future king of 16 sovereign nations, standing alone beside the departure board, wearing a navy jacket that was good quality but not remarkable, holding a worn leather bag over one shoulder and staring at the tube map on the wall in front of him with the focused, slightly panicked expression of a man who has just realized that the geography of something he thought he understood is considerably more complicated than he was led to believe. There were 2 protection officers nearby. I know this now. At the time, I didn't see them because they were doing their jobs correctly, which is to say they were standing at a distance that made them look like ordinary commuters, which is to say they were standing close enough to matter and far enough away to allow what William was clearly attempting to create around himself, a bubble of ordinary. He had a notebook in his left hand. Small, dark green, the kind you buy in a pack of 3 from a stationery shop. The kind that has no significance until someone makes it significant. He found his platform. He got on the train. He sat in a regular seat, not a first-class carriage. And he looked out of the window as London moved past him, and he wrote something in the notebook. And I stood at the far end of the carriage with my cold coffee and thought, something is beginning here, and I have absolutely no idea what it is. It took me 3 weeks to find out. To understand what William was doing on that tube platform, you have to first understand what his life had been before it. There is a version of royal life that the public imagines, grand rooms, formal dinners, historic ceremony, and that version is accurate as far as it goes. But what it misses is something subtler and in its own way, more total. What it misses is the completeness of the management. Every room Prince William entered in the first 4 decades of his life had been assessed before he arrived. Not just security assessed, though that too, always that, but socially assessed. The people in those rooms had been chosen, briefed, and in many cases rehearsed, not because anyone was being deceptive, but because that is the system that has grown up around British royalty over centuries, a vast, well-intentioned apparatus designed to make every encounter smooth, every conversation productive, every visit successful. It is a machine built for efficiency, and it runs beautifully. What it does not do, cannot do by its very nature, is deliver surprise. William has spoken publicly about his mother, Diana, and her extraordinary ability to connect with people who were suffering, to sit with them in hospitals and hospices, and hold their hands and make them feel genuinely seen. It is one of the most remarked upon qualities in the entire modern history of the royal family. And when you examine what made it possible, when you look closely at how Diana actually operated in those rooms, you find something specific and consistent. She was not performing connection. She had found a way to be genuinely present in a way that the machinery around her had not managed to suppress. William had been thinking about this for years. He has said so in various interviews in various forms. He had been thinking about the distance, the structural, institutional, architectural distance between where he stood and where most people lived. And then the Earthshot Prize happened. The Earthshot Prize was William's largest, most serious contribution to the climate conversation, a global initiative awarding £1 million each to 5 winners per year who had found innovative solutions to the planet's environmental challenges. It was ambitious, well-funded, and genuinely impactful. But as it gathered momentum, as William traveled the world meeting scientists and engineers and community leaders who were doing the extraordinary work of repairing things, he began to notice something uncomfortable. The people who would be most affected by climate change, the people the Earthshot Prize was ultimately in service of, were not the scientists in the rooms with him. They were the fishermen in Wales whose catch was shrinking. the farmer in Norfolk whose soil was changing, the family in Birmingham whose city flooded twice in 3 years, the ship worker in Glasgow whose entire industry had already been swept away by one kind of change and was now being asked to adapt to another. He knew their names in aggregate, he knew their statistics, he had read the briefing documents. But he had never simply sat with them. In late autumn, he told his team he wanted to change that. He did not announce it publicly. He did not frame it as a project or a program or an initiative with a name and a logo. He simply said he wanted to spend several months moving through ordinary British life with as little apparatus around him as possible. A notebook, a small team, no prepared crowds, no pre-selected community representatives briefed on appropriate topics of conversation. His team, to their considerable credit, said yes. After reportedly several days of very serious discussions about logistics, security and protocol. They said yes. He started in February, on a Tuesday morning. At Waterloo Station, in the rain. The notebook was his idea. This is worth noting because it tells you something about the spirit in which the whole thing was undertaken. He did not arrive at this project with a camera crew, a documentary concept, or a communication strategy. He arrived at it with a 3-pack of stationery shop notebooks and a decision to write down what he saw. The decision itself had been building for some time. People close to William describe a gradual shift in the years following the launch of Earthshot, a growing frustration not with the work itself, but with the gap between the work and the world it was meant to serve. He was meeting innovators and prize winners and heads of state and philanthropists. He was having important conversations with important people about important things, and all of it was real and all of it mattered. But somewhere in the machinery of all that importance, something was getting lost, or rather something was never quite being found. There is a moment that people who know William well point to as the specific turning point, though they are careful not to over-dramatize it. He had been at an Earthshot event in London, a panel discussion involving climate scientists, policymakers, and business leaders. The conversation was sophisticated and the participants were brilliant. And at one point, someone on the panel used the phrase "the ordinary person on the street," used it as a category, a demographic, a receptacle for policy. And William, sitting in the front row, wrote something in the margin of his program. No one knows exactly what he wrote, but the people who were with him that evening say that something in his expression shifted, and that on the car journey home he was very quiet, and that the next morning he told his private secretary he wanted to talk about a new kind of engagement. The ordinary person on the street, he had apparently decided, deserved to be something more than a phrase in a panel discussion. They deserved to be an actual person, on an actual street, who he actually visited. It took 3 months to organize what should have been, in theory, very simple. A prince going for a walk. The protection considerations alone ran to dozens of pages. But eventually the framework was established, the parameters were set, and William packed a leather bag, picked up his notebook, and went to Waterloo Station. He was going to Norfolk first, to a market town he had driven through many times, but never stopped in. He was going to stop this time, not because anything went wrong, because everything was so completely disarmingly normal. The market in Fakenham runs on Thursdays. It has done so without significant interruption for over 800 years. Stalls selling vegetables and second-hand books and phone cases and kitchen equipment and plants and cheese and things that defy easy categorization. The people who run these stalls are not performing quaintness for tourists. They are working. They are cold because it is February and Norfolk does not care about February, and they are drinking tea from flasks and talking to each other across the narrow gaps between stalls about things that have nothing to do with kings or climate or the fate of the planet. William walked through it with one protection officer at a visible distance and one at a distance that required you to know what you were looking for. He bought a bag of apples. He asked the woman selling them how business had been. She told him in the specific and unsentimental way of Norfolk market traders that it had been better and it had been worse, and at least it wasn't raining today. He wrote something in his notebook. She gave him an apple she hadn't charged him for and turned to the next customer. He tried to use the card reader to pay and got it wrong twice before she took it from him with patient efficiency and tapped it herself without comment. He stood at the edge of the market for a while after that, not moving, just watching. a woman with a double pushchair negotiating the gap between two stalls, an elderly man examining second-hand paperbacks with the serious focus of someone making a decision that genuinely matters, two teenagers eating chips and conducting a conversation so rapid and reference-dense that it was functionally a private language, a stall holder refolding a tablecloth that the wind had disturbed, doing it with the automatic practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this exact action 10,000 times. He wrote 4 pages in the notebook before he moved on. Glasgow was different. Glasgow is always different from what you expect it to be, which is part of why people who know it love it, and part of why people who don't know it get it consistently wrong. It is not grim in the way that lazy journalism has long suggested. It is not cheerful in the relentless, performed way that civic tourism campaigns sometimes try to project. It is something more complicated and more interesting than either a city with a specific muscular pride that has been tested repeatedly and has not quite been broken. William visited a housing estate in the East End, not for a ribbon cutting, not for a community program launch. He just walked in on a Wednesday morning with his notebook and his leather bag, and he sat in the community center that smelled of instant coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. And he talked to whoever wanted to talk to him. Some people didn't want to. That was fine. That happened. A man in his 30s walked past, clocked him, said "I," right in a tone that conveyed an entire editorial position without requiring elaboration, and kept walking. William did not appear to take this personally. He wrote something in his notebook, which may or may not have been "I." Right, it would be entirely appropriate if it was. Others sat with him. A young mother, a retired teacher, a youth worker who had been operating in this community for 22 years on funding that was never quite secure enough to allow for long-term planning. They talked about what they talked about, school places and the bus route that had been cut, and the community garden that someone had started and that was, against reasonable expectation, still going, and the fact that the chippy on the corner had closed, and what that actually meant to the daily texture of a neighborhood when you thought about it carefully. William listened. He asked follow-up questions, specific ones, not polite ones. He wrote things down. He did not offer solutions or programs or pledges, he just listened. And then there was David. David was 71 years old. He had worked in the Clyde shipyards for 26 years. He had been made redundant in 1993 when the yard closed, one of thousands of men whose professional identity disappeared in a period of restructuring that the economics textbooks describe as inevitable and the people who lived through it describe differently. He had retrained. Eventually, he had found other work. Eventually, he had built a life from the pieces that remained. Eventually. He was not bitter, or not primarily bitter, but he was precise about what had been lost, and he had the kind of precision that comes from having had a very long time to think about something very clearly. He sat with William for 40 minutes over tea that William did not make correctly. He put the milk in first, which David noted with a look of restrained anguish, and he talked. He talked about what it felt like to have a skill that the world no longer required, about the specific quality of pride that comes from making something with your hands, something large, something seaworthy, something that carries people across water, and what happens to a man when that pride has nowhere to go. About the difference between being retrained for a new economy and being genuinely valued by one, about what dignity actually costs and who pays it and who decides that the price is acceptable. William wrote 4 pages. He barely spoke. At one point David said, not unkindly, "You're very quiet for a prince." And William said that he was finding it more useful to listen. And David said, "Aye, that'll do," and kept going. When William left, David shook his hand and said, "Good luck with whatever you're trying to do." He said it in the tone of a man who genuinely hoped that something useful would come of it, and who had enough experience of the world to know that this was not guaranteed. Wales came next, a fishing village on the Pembrokeshire coast, where the crab and lobster catch had been declining for a decade in ways that the fishermen understood in their bodies before any scientific report confirmed it in print. The sea was changing temperature. The migration patterns of what lived in it were shifting. The men who had fished these waters for their entire adult lives, as their fathers had, as their grandfathers had, or watching the change happen with a specific quality of attention that no monitoring equipment could fully replicate. William went out on a boat. He got seasick. This is not mentioned in any official account of the visit, because there is no official account. The visit was not announced, but the fisherman who took him out, a man named Reese, who has the particular economy of speech that seems to develop naturally in people who spend long hours on water, mentioned it afterwards to a friend who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually it made its way to me in the way that most true things do, sideways, casually, several weeks after it happened. Reese apparently handed William a ginger biscuit, the specific and time-honored Welsh fisherman's remedy for seasickness, presented without ceremony or sympathy, and William ate it and recovered, and then asked Reese to explain what he was seeing in the water, and Reese explained it, and William wrote it down. Birmingham was a school, a secondary school in Erdington, with 1,100 students, a dedicated staff operating under budget constraints that required a specific and exhausting form of daily creativity, and a head teacher named Margaret, who had been running the school for 14 years and who treated William's visit with the same brisk, warm efficiency with which she appeared to treat everything else, as something that needed to be done well and without fuss. She gave him 30 minutes in the corridor between lessons. Not in her office, in the corridor, where the actual school was happening, the noise and movement and managed chaos of 1,100 young people moving between classes, conducting their social lives in the gaps, performing the complex daily work of becoming themselves. He stood against the wall and watched. Students noticed him and unnoticed him with remarkable speed, the way that teenagers process celebrity when they are in the middle of something more immediately important, which is to say they registered him, established he was not relevant to the current social moment, and moved on. One girl stopped, looked at him directly, said, "Are you actually him?" Received confirmation that he was, said Mad, and went to maths. He wrote that down too. It was in Birmingham that it happened, the thing that reordered everything that had come before it. William was sitting in the school canteen during lunch. Margaret had given him a corner table and a cup of tea that was also not made correctly, but in a different way from David's, when a boy of about 15 sat down across from him without asking. Not rudely, just with the casual confidence of someone who had decided that the available seating situation justified it. His name was Marcus. He was in year 10. He was eating a jacket potato with beans and conducting simultaneously a WhatsApp conversation on a phone that was technically not supposed to be out at lunch. He acknowledged William with a nod in the way that you acknowledge someone you have decided to be comfortable around, and then he said something that stopped William completely. He said, "We all knew you were coming, you know, like weeks ago." William looked at him, not like officially. Marcus continued eating his jacket potato. Just word gets around, doesn't it? Someone's cousin saw you somewhere or whatever. And then everyone knew, and then everyone sort of decided, we're just going to be normal about it. William said, "Everyone decided that." Marcus shrugged. Kind of just happened, like, why would we perform for you? We've got our own stuff going on. He went back to his jacket potato and his WhatsApp conversation with the serene self-possession of someone who has said the true thing and doesn't need to underline it. William sat with that for a while, and then, slowly, the whole sequence of the previous months rearranged itself in his understanding. The woman in the Norfolk market who had taken the card reader from him without comment and given him an extra apple, she had known who he was. She had simply decided that her Thursday morning was going to proceed on its own terms regardless. David, with his 40 minutes of precise and unsentimental testimony about dignity and redundancy, David had known exactly who he was talking to. He had chosen to speak plainly anyway. He had extended William the respect of not adjusting his truth for a royal audience. Reese on the boat, handing over the ginger biscuit without a word of ceremony. Reese had known. And he had decided that seasickness was seasickness regardless of who was experiencing it, and that the ginger biscuit was the appropriate response, and that was that. The students who had clocked him and moved on to maths, they had known. They had simply determined collectively and instinctively that performing surprise or deference was less interesting than being themselves. William had come on this project believing he was the observer. He had his notebook. He was going to watch ordinary life and write it down and understand it better. What he had actually encountered was something different. He had encountered ordinary people who saw him clearly, who knew who he was, what he represented, what distance he had traveled to be there, and who had extended him, without announcement or fanfare, the extraordinary grace of simply continuing to be themselves in front of him. They had given him the rarest possible thing, unedited reality. And they had done it not because they were unaware of him, but precisely because they were. He wrote that down. It took more than 4 pages. He went back to Glasgow. He didn't have to. It wasn't part of any plan. But he got on the train, he found the platform correctly this time, without consulting the map, and he went back to the community centre that smelled of instant coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. And he asked if David was around. David was. He was playing cards with 3 other men his age, a game that appeared to involve a level of strategic complexity and competitive intensity that suggested these were not casual participants. David looked up, looked at William, looked at the notebook in William's hand, looked back at his cards, and said, "Sit down then, I'll be with you in a minute." William sat down. He waited. He watched the card game. He did not write anything. He just watched. After 20 minutes, David's side won, which he acknowledged with a quiet satisfaction that suggested this was the natural outcome and the cards had simply confirmed it. And he got up and got 2 cups of tea, milk in last this time, without being asked, and sat across from William and said, "Well?" And William said he had been thinking about what David had told him, about pride and skill and what it costs to have something you're good at become unnecessary, about the difference between being retrained and being valued, about the gap between policy language and the actual texture of a life. David listened to this without interrupting, and then William said he didn't have an answer, that he wasn't there to bring one, that he had come back because he thought the conversation wasn't finished. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the worst part was? When the yard closed, William said he didn't. It wasn't the money." David said, "We managed. You manage. It wasn't even the work, exactly." He paused. He was precise about this, the way he was precise about everything. It was that nobody who made the decision had ever stood in the yard. They knew what we built. They didn't know what it meant to build it. There's a difference. William wrote that down. He wrote it slowly. David watched him write it and didn't say anything while he did. And when he was finished, David said, "I hope someone reads that." And William said, "I will. Every day, probably." And David said, "That'll do," and went back to his card game. It is the closest thing to a scene of resolution that this story has. It is not dramatic. There is no speech, no ceremony, no moment of visible transformation. It is 2 people sitting across from each other in a room that smells of instant coffee, one of them talking with the precision that comes from having thought about something for 30 years, and one of them writing it down. But something passed between them that was real, and that mattered, and that neither of them has spoken about publicly since. The notebook filled up completely sometime in April. William started a second one. He came back to his public life, to the Earthshot Prize events and the royal engagements and the formal visits and the prepared rooms with the selected people and the briefing documents, but the people who work with him closely say that something had shifted, and it had shifted in a way that is difficult to describe precisely but easy to recognize. He asks different questions now. Not better questions, necessarily. His questions were always good, but different ones, more specific, less about systems and more about texture, less about outcomes and more about cost. When he meets with Earthshot Prize winners, the scientists, the engineers, the community innovators, he asks them not just what their solution does, but who taught them to see the problem in the first place. Whose voice is in the room? Whose voice is missing? He asks about the ordinary person on the street, but he asks it differently, not as a demographic category, as a specific human being with a specific life that is already fully in progress, that does not pause and prepare itself for royal observation, that continues on its own terms regardless of who is watching. The Earthshot team, several of whom have worked with William for years, describe a change in the way he moves through rooms. Not a dramatic change. He is not a different person. He is the same person with more room in his listening. He is quieter in a way that makes other people speak more. He lets silences exist instead of filling them. One of his advisors told me carefully that the months of what she called the Notebook Project, She was the only person in the team who used that phrase openly, had given William something that no briefing document could have provided: the specific gravity of real lives, the weight of actual human particularity, the understanding, not just intellectual but felt, that policy decisions land in specific bodies, in specific places, on specific Thursday mornings, in specific markets in Norfolk. He still gets coffee wrong sometimes. The people who work closely with him say he has developed a system where he watches what the person in front of him in the queue orders and repeats it, which works most of the time and fails spectacularly when the person in front of him orders something complicated. He takes this with equanimity. He has also reportedly become considerably better at reading tube maps. Though his protection team still stands ready, I saw him again in June. It was a public event, one of the Earthshot prize ceremonies, held at a venue in London that had been cleaned and assessed and prepared in all the usual ways. The room was full of the usual people: scientists and philanthropists and policymakers and business leaders and journalists. The usual machinery was running at full capacity. Everything was smooth. William came in and worked the room the way he always has, with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times and has found a genuine warmth within the performance of it. He was good at it. He has always been good at it. But I watched him stop twice at moments when the prepared program did not require him to stop. Once to speak at length with a young Kenyan woman who was not on the official list of significant guests, but who had something specific to say about community water systems, and said it with the directness of someone who had walked a long way to be in that room. Once to look for a while at a photograph on the exhibition wall, a fishing boat, small weathered, on grey water, and to stand with it quietly before the schedule moved him on. And I thought about the notebook. It is on his desk at Kensington now, the first one. Full. He has said this to a small number of people. Not publicly, the second one is nearly full too. He is apparently on his way to needing a third. The oak tree outside Windsor is still there. It was there when William's grandmother was born. It was there when William was born. It will almost certainly be there when the children who are currently eating jacket potatoes in a Birmingham school canteen are old enough to have children of their own. It has stood through everything and changed nothing except its own slow, patient, accumulating growth. And somewhere in Glasgow, David is probably playing cards, he is probably winning, and he probably still puts the milk in last without being asked, for anyone who comes to sit across from him with a notebook and a genuine willingness to listen. That it turns out is not a small thing. That it turns out is almost everything.